The history behind African American voting rights is that there is no history before 1868 in regards to voting. Even in 1868, African Americans were not granted the right to vote, but their citizenship was just finalized. The reason for African American citizenship being finalized in 1868 was because Abraham Lincoln passed the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in 1864, which led to the 14th Amendment being passed in 1868 that gave African Americans or former slaves to be granted citizenship. It wasn't until 1870 when Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which allowed voting rights to not be denied by anyone or anywhere based upon someone's race or color. After Jim Crow laws were established in 1896, this led to the declaration in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which states that black and white people can be separated but still equal. It wasn't until nearly 25 years later, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was signed, giving American women the right to vote, but African American women would have to wait nearly 50 years for the same rights. In the 1950s and early 60s, making sure voting rights were met for African Americans was the main focus of the Civil Rights Movement in 1964. While the Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned segregation in schools, it did not ban discrimination in voting. From the years of 1960 to 2011, voter turnouts for African Americans were reported to be drastically lower than whites. But in 2012, black voter turnouts were higher than white voter turnouts, allowing 66.6% of black voters to re-elect President Barack Obama. Today, in America, there is 1 in every 13 black people who are not eligible to vote because of disenfranchisement laws.
There are many prominent individuals who spoke out and events that took place that were crucial in regard to African American voting rights. But of these many, there are a select few who stands out the most. According to the A History of Voting Rights video, Abraham Lincoln, 1861, the 14th Amendment, President Eisenhower, January 20th, 1953 through January 20th, 1961, the Civil Rights Act, Martin Luther King Jr., the Selma to Montgomery March, President Lyndon, and the Voting Rights Act are the ones who truly stand out. President Lincoln believed that freed slaves who were intelligent or who served as soldiers should be allowed to vote. And in 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed and made that belief a right for African American men. But sadly, although it was now their right to vote, many didn't because they were often threatened. 1865, Andrew Johnson was put in charge of reconstructing the Union. While completing this task, he was very tolerable of white Southerners in his Reconstruction policy. This allowed states to reinstate their own post-war governments as long as they ratified the 13th Amendment and vowed their allegiance to the Union. Ergo, the majority of state legislators in the South introduced black laws that were set in place from 1865 to 1866. These laws were a major setback. But gratefully, the Civil Rights Act was soon passed. President Eisenhower signed the first modern Civil Rights Act in 1957 that enforced voting rights. Martin Luther King Jr. led the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965 in order to get better voting laws. And although this is the only thing mentioned about Martin Luther King Jr. in the video, he is a very honorable mention because not only was he an ordained Baptist minister and social rights activist that had many successful and peaceful protests, but he was also the leader of the Civil Rights Movement. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into action by President Lyndon Johnson. This act was put into effect in order to prevent districts and states from restricting voting based off of color, race, and the language of an individual.
In the 2016 election, African American voters made up 26% of Democratic voters. In fact, African American women are the most loyal portion of Democratic voters. That percentage could only be increased if we didn't have disenfranchisement of felons. Our votes matter because without them, the Black community will never be represented properly. Black voters everywhere are often ignored and forgotten by candidates, elected officials, political parties, and even the media. There are too many of us to not be able to make change, but if we all vote, then I'm 100% sure we can make a change.
Today, as the 15th Amendment still protects African Americans and the voting rights shall allow African Americans to vote, but there's still different ways of black voter suppression. One of the ways is by the fact of felons cannot vote after being released from prison. There are far more African Americans than any other race behind bars. Even the ones who have served their time still can't vote. That makes a majority of black men and only decrease the amount of voters we have.
Although African Americans have voting rights, there's still a long way to go. A prime example being the decade since affirmative action policies were first instituted, the poverty rate has remained almost unchanged. Affirmative action being a policy in which an individual's color, race, sex, religion, or national origin are taken into account to increase opportunities provided to an underrepresented part of society. Close to 30% of black families still live below the poverty line due to unapologetic public and private real estate policies of steering African Americans to substandard housing in isolated Chicago neighborhoods. In a way, not that far from the 19th century, where free people of color lived in cities in the North and the Upper South in clumped rural areas. In conclusion, although African Americans have been fighting for their rights from the 1700s up through the start and the end of the Civil War movement, and even now they aren't being given the same rights as others. Due to this injustice, multiple protests for African American rights were caused, such as the March on Washington, Selma to Montgomery March, the Freedom Riders, even now, the protests of the death of George Floyd, an African American killed while pleading that he couldn't breathe. Although the journey towards voting rights is almost over, we still have a long way to go for the rights of African Americans as a whole. The words of Martin Luther King Jr., "We must learn to live together as brothers, or we will perish together as fools."